This episode, I'm joined by Patrick O'Connor, who is a senior lecturer in philosophy in the School of Digital Technologies and Arts at Staffordshire University. In this episode, we discuss his recently released book, Cormac McCarthy, Philosophy and the Physics of the Damned. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix, gain access to some exclusive content, or simply support the podcast, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. Patrick O'Connor, thanks very much for joining us on the Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing your book, Cormac McCarthy, Philosophy and the Physics of the Damned, which was published just a few months ago, February this year, 2022, by Edinburgh University Press. And as people would imagine, this is a book dealing with the philosophy, but also the literary philosophy and the physics of Cormac McCarthy. And for those of you that know of Cormac McCarthy primarily as a novelist and thinking, why is the physics aspect in there? Cormac McCarthy generally, as I understand it, from the very few snippets of biographical information we have about the man, likes to spend most of his time at the Santa Fe Institute, basically spending his time with around people in STEM and science, and doesn't like to hang around with bourgeoisie, annoying novelists.
With people like me.
Yeah, with people like me and you. Pretentious people who talk on podcasts all day. So, yeah, thanks for coming on. And, just tell us...
glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and, how this very articulate, interesting, and very accessible book on Cormac McCarthy came about.
Oh, well, thank you. You're probably the first person, probably the first human that read it, so that's really encouraging. How did it come about? I'll tell you about myself first. I am a senior lecturer in philosophy at Staffordshire University, your old haunting ground, as I understand it. I'm from the Republic of Ireland, Southwest Republic of Ireland, in a place called Ballinskelligs, which has recently become famous for Star Wars. It's where Luke Skywalker hangs out in the new movies. I haven't seen them, but I'm told they're very good. And I think I got into Cormac McCarthy, what is it, 2022? Maybe 20 years ago. A friend of mine gave me a book to read. He gave me Blood Meridian to read. He said, there you go, have a read of that. See what you think of that. And of course, Blood Meridian is possibly one of the most violent... That's a good way of putting it, yeah. It's disgusting. It's violent. Dead babies. You name it, turns up on it. Beautiful, beautiful violence. And so I read that. I was like, I kind of had to sort of... wash out the insides of my head after it for a while. And I didn't read Cormac McCarthy then for another couple of years. And the same friend came up to me on Christmas Eve, said, there you go, there's a nice Christmas Day read for you. And it was The Road. So I read that in about a day and I said, all right, I need to get back into this guy. So it took on from there. And I thought that McCarthy is someone who's, well, he's an interesting cat, right? He's interested in literature, he's interested in philosophy, and he writes great novels.
Oddly enough, exactly the same trajectory as me. A lot of people in my sphere were going on about Blood Meridian, saying that this is basically our Moby Dick. This is phenomenal. You'll never read anything like it. Read it, washed my mind out with soap. Took a year back, went, okay, that was that. I need to take some time out. Then went to The Road. And then after that, started taking him. Just went, okay, this guy's... No one else... There is only one other novel from another novelist that I can think of that comes close to McCarthy, which is a not that well-known novel called Laurus by Eugene Vodolozkin. Not many people know it, but I remember when I read it, I went, this is the closest someone else has got to McCarthy. But no one else... It's almost sad, right? Because you've only got those 12, soon to be 14 novels, which is surprising. People like McCarthy who write in that way, who are very reclusive. Usually, I'm thinking of someone like Salinger. I feel we're lucky that we actually got more than 3. He's the kind of guy you'd imagine would go, "There's Blood Meridian. I'm never writing again." So I feel lucky. So before we jump in with your book, I have to ask you the Hermitix question.
Oh, sure,
you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? But McCarthy, He's already in there waiting, which is probably...
Okay, McCarthy's in there, yeah. To be honest with you, James, I wasn't sure if I should put him in there. Not because he's uninteresting or unintelligent or wouldn't have interesting things to say. I just don't think he'd be into it that much. I think he's quite... he's famously standoffish. And as you say, he's quite reclusive, so I'm not sure he'd be too pleased hanging around with Heidegger and Schopenhauer and folk like that. So yeah. I mean, but then again, he doesn't get to choose, so put him in there. In terms of the other three, I had to think about it. I like these games. So one thinker, I was thinking I could put in like Schopenhauer, but James, he would, and he'd just be the ambassador for no crack, It wouldn't be a convivial evening. Oh, really, yeah? So, maybe we could put in the young Schopenhauer, yeah. I was also thinking about Nietzsche, and I thought, Nietzsche, yeah. Well, Nietzsche does a good game. He talks all about joy and affirmation and life affirming and rejecting denial and all these things. But really, we know it. He was painfully shy, and he was very socially awkward. And I don't think he would have given us a good evening. So I'm measuring it in terms of how we might have a nice evening, rather than necessarily the philosophical fireworks that would emerge. So I think that the person I'm going to put in there is David Hume. I think, because I quite like David Hume. I think he's a great writer. I think he's a great philosopher, and I think he would be a bit of crack. I think he would be. You get a drink out of him. You might be able to get a game of pool out of him as well. So I think he would make for a good evening. The others is I think I would like to have Rebecca Goldstein in there, the American philosopher. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, or I'm sure some of you are. No, Rebecca Goldstein is no, she's an American philosopher. She's currently, is that Emma Goldstein perhaps you're thinking of, is it, or maybe I'm not sure on that either myself. But anyway, Rebecca Goldstein, she's written a great book called The Mind-Body Problem. So she writes kind of autobiographical memoir style philosophies. She's got a great essay called Mattering Matters, she talks about the idea of the mattering instinct, so it's this idea that, that yes, certainly we are animals, but, we're evolutionary creatures and we need to pay attention to science and all that stuff, but we also have this instinct for the things which matter, which probably is one of the things that I detected Cormac McCarthy. She'd be great. Also, I think she'd be a bit of fun. Her books are fun. So like Mind Body Problem, she wrote like a really fun book called Plato at the Googleplex. And book on Spinoza. Anyway, and the third one I thought would be, I think I was going to think outside the box on this one, so I thought that it would be let's see, I'm going to try this out on you, James. So I was reading Jared Diamond recently. I was reading his book Collapse. So Jared Diamond does what Jared Diamond does in that. So he does what he does in Guns, Germs and Steel. He presents a long materialist, geographical, socio-history of humanity, except in Collapse he does it from the perspective of societies which upended. And one of the societies he looks at was the Norse community in Greenland from about 900 to I think about, it was like maybe 1300, and effectively, as you might guess from the title, that society collapsed. And it was for a variety of reasons, I think he claims, for a variety of reasons. So one reason was like climate change, not our climate change, not man-made climate change, but the Little Ice Age, which basically cut Greenland off from other Scandinavian countries like Iceland and Norway. And also, I think it was, they had an extractive urge. They basically created a lot of soil erosion, cut down trees, and it upset the wildlife and the flora and the fauna, and they weren't able to regenerate. Although they did manage to do it for about 300 years. He also thinks that the society collapsed, went into extinction effectively, for some very funny reason. They didn't eat fish for some bizarre reason, which we don't really know why, which was a bit of an oversight. Yeah, it was. I think Diamond's claim is it was like they had a taboo reason for it, and they didn't really. He also says they were culturally conservative. Sort of, they were culturally conservative Christian communities, or early Christian communities, and I don't think it was necessarily the conservatism that killed them, but it meant that they weren't open to innovations and adaptations. So all of that. But to cut a long story short, the philosopher I'd want is the last individual from that community. And I think it was quite possibly I think it was like a young 25-year-old man the archaeologists found evidence of. And I think he had a hell of a time. He was just like, they were just eating hooves and stuff like that, and eventually they died. So that last man, I think he would be an interesting character to have at a dinner party. Yeah, a version of that. It's a version of that. Yeah, I didn't even think of that. Now, like, Diamond is interesting in this because he's like going, well, no, we shouldn't be too, critical of this community. Like, 400 years isn't bad. Like, it's older than, they lasted longer than America up to this point, and maybe America will catch up. But yeah, I didn't even think of that. It is a kind of an individual and civilizational decay. The last anti-natalist, or the last natalist, perhaps. Yeah,
it's interesting. That's a very interesting person to put in the room. I don't know what humor. I mean, one thing we definitely can't go down this rabbit hole. But you mentioned that you might get a game of pool out of humor. Are you a pool player?
Once upon a time, I used to work in a pub when I was young, and after the pub, I come from quite a rural area, so it's one of the things to do. And I wouldn't say I'm very good, but I very much like pool. I like snooker as well. I'm terrible at snooker, as you know, good at pool, bad at snooker. Very pleased to see Ronnie O'Sullivan win the World Championships at the weekend. Edit it out, James. Yeah. We're really sorry to bore your listeners now.
Talking about snooker. One day I'll have a philosophy of snooker. I mean, just as an aside, my room, if I was ever to pick one, I would have to have Alex Higgins in there, and a snooker table, right?
Absolutely. Now that would be a good night. That would be wouldn't be a good morning. No, it would talk about speaking of civilizational detritus.
To be fair, I think I can actually segue from this into the first question. And actually in a very apt and specific way. Your cover image is actually the image of McCarthy, one of the few images we have of McCarthy stood with a pool cue in his hand, actually.
I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah, it's a good image, isn't it? Yeah.
And, it's interesting that you come from somewhere such as myself where it's rural, people are very salt of the earth, I imagine. These very quite sort of old archaic games such as pool. And I think McCarthy probably has the same temperament. And there's something about this in McCarthy which is perhaps not anti-urban, not anti-social, but very existing in a world and a consciousness which is clearly still has these connections. The sort of bars where they're genuinely authentic, they're covered in brass horseshoes, which at one point probably, only 100 years ago were actually used. And this
for games, yeah.
Yeah, and this sort of this imminent connection to and connection with, even in his modern novels, a connection to a sort of a consciousness and a feeling which has always been there for humanity. And I wonder what that is. Maybe that's what led us both to sort of intuitively get on with McCarthy's work so much.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things there, I suppose. I mean, the idea of play as well. I think that's something that's in his work. That he does, especially the early novels. He's quite heavy. He's quite solemn. He's quite pessimistic, quite bleak, frankly, in many instances. But he does have a very playful side to him, I think. I mean, if you look at something like Suttree, Suttree is just really very funny. It's there's very huge parts of Suttree that are hilarious, in fact. And I think he has that dimension of his thinking, which is quite playful and kind of quite irreverent. Kind of undermines existing pieties and structures. And I think that works to his work. The other dimension of it, I suppose, is I'm culturally Catholic, so I think so is he. And I think that comes through in his work as well.
I just converted, so maybe that's why.
To Catholicism.
Yeah, from being an atheist to being a Catholic. Yeah, so maybe that's why it always resonated with me. It's interesting. I mean, that irreverence is really interesting. I was sort of Suttree, unfortunately, is the one I've spent the least time with. I'm currently rereading Child of God, and Suttree's, I don't know, I have this thing with authors that I love where I don't want to spoil myself because I know, I love them so much. I don't want to go too far because then I'll ruin it.
You want to savor it.
Yeah, savor it. But Child of God has this irreverence in relation to violence where at certain points I think, is this like the blackest comedy I've ever read? Or, the line that he has between very almost absurd people who are just absurd in their acceptance of the meaningless of the place they're within and their position in the world borders on, as you say, he's just sleeping on this mattress, the cockroaches are clawing over him, he's just sleeping next to some dead cat, and you think, is this the darkest thing I've ever read, or is this actually bleak? Is this comedy? What is this? And then 2 pages later you're going on to another scene. And it's I wonder what that line is. Where am I meant? Am I meant to laugh?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think especially in Suttree. Suttree for your listeners, I would, if any book I would recommend to read of Cormac McCarthy would be Suttree. I think it's his best. I know most people would say Blood Meridian, and for good reason. Harold Bloom says Blood Meridian is his best, and far be it for me to disabuse the great Harold Bloom, but I prefer Suttree for that comedic element. What does Suttree start out with? Suttree starts out, once you get past the first 30 pages, I think Suttree kicks in to gear, right? It's quite tough for the first 30 or 40 pages, but it starts out with a guy basically fucking a watermelon, and there's no other way to say that. I mean, I'm sure I've just ruined your educational audience here, but through swearing. But that's I think that's just it. I think that's what I was trying to accomplish in the book as well. I think with McCarthy as a figure, I don't think he's particularly fideistic. I mean, I think you can't really understand his work without understanding religion and spirituality. I think they all play out in the book, but I don't think he's particularly, theologically inclined. I mean, he says as much. He said in an interview typically elliptically, he said he was, depends what day you ask him. Some days yes, some days no. So I guess you could put that down as an agnostic. But I think, he's in my book, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to show how he brought all these different strains together. So he brings irreverence, but he also brings sort of a spiritual dimension to how he composes his literature.
It's almost like you don't want to keep watching. You don't it's almost if you watch too long and there's the guy having sex with not to go down this crass segue, but the image of someone having sex with a watermelon at first is sort of humorous, but actually the longer and more detailed in McCarthy's prose that this is described, you suddenly realize you're really watching a feat of complete nihilism.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. It is really funny, and it's anti-Edenic. That's the Garden of Eden, is somebody engaging in sexual congress with a fruit, But it's also a commentary on human disconnection and human loneliness. He's not, Harrogate doesn't really have a girlfriend, and he doesn't really have any friends other than Suttree. And Suttree himself is a very lonely character. That's the other side of, this sort of gung-ho culture, this gung-ho individualist culture, which Suttree comes out of. He's the flip side of individualism is loneliness and isolation. And in Suttree, what's so interesting about Suttree is that you have the tragedy of that, and it's funny, and it's disruptive, and it's irreverent, and it's brilliant, but at the same time, McCarthy's asking, how can you ameliorate that? How can you ameliorate that? And Suttree is interesting because it is, it's this community of the wretched of the earth, the community of outcasts which he constructs.
Oh, this is a huge question for me because obviously I had this original question of what are the philosophical themes going through McCarthy's work, and I think on a surface level, people would say, "Well, violence, war, bleakness, sort of the I don't know the pointlessness of." But I think that's surface level, and it's definitely there. But the really interesting thing for me is that even though in every book the human characters are so well fleshed out and they play such an important role, at all times McCarthy writes them and writes the narrative in such a way that actually they still seem to play a background role at all times. It's like the writing or the language is what's taking center stage, and it's like, okay, well, I'll explain to you what's going on with these human characters, but they're not characters. They're like humans in a big play for McCarthy, and there's other factors which are just as important as that. So that idea of to what you were saying, sorry, the idea of that loneliness is like, it's almost like, yeah, they're lonely, but that's their problem. We're not here to. I'm not going to solve. It's not like Dostoevsky. I'm not here to solve their loneliness. Right? They're lonely in this world. I'm not here to solve that with my writing.
I get you. Yeah. So the thought would be that, So yes, he's quite concrete writer as well. I think, it's very embedded in place, and he's very attuned to the geography of the worlds he constructs, and the people almost kind of just sort of float above it. Sometimes you can't even say that they're characters, I would say. He does have some great characters. Like, I think the father and son in The Road are quite good characters. Well, they're biographical characters. They're based on according to himself, they're based on him and his son. And I think he basically said he just basically put in verbatim conversations he had with his kid. That I don't know. Yeah, I think it was in Ireland actually, or thought about to comprise The Road. Although don't hold me to that. So it was like. He did stay in a B&B in Ireland around about 2004, 2005. I do know that because I found a receipt in the archive. But whether he composed The Road there, I do not know.
Yeah, that's sort of a testament to Ireland. So to say to someone, you've created a very, very bleak novel. What inspired you? I was just in Ireland for a couple of months.
In Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, ironically though, I don't know if you'd agree with me here, but even though the Road is phenomenal, I think it's his weakest novel. And it's the one with the two clearest characters in. And maybe it is weak for that reason, that the thing that he's normally focusing on is a bit lost.
Yeah, I think The Road is the novel I would probably tell people to read if they recommended Cormac McCarthy. Yeah. Is it the weakest? Oh, they're all so good. I don't know. I'd probably say The Orchard Keeper, although The Orchard Keeper is really good as well, I think, but it's got a lot going for it. Yeah, it was his first novel as well, so I don't think it's as accomplished as the novels that came afterwards. Immediately afterwards, even works like Child of God and Outer Dark, which are brilliant, and I recommend all your listeners to have a read. Outer Dark especially is fantastic. And Outer Dark actually is quite similar in structure to The Road. So it's got this, these wandering, resolute, borderless folk going from place to place, trying to figure out their lost origins. Yeah. yeah. Sorry, go ahead, James.
I was going to say about Outer Dark, just in relation to the human thing and the place of humans. I mean, there's a brilliant bit in Outer Dark. One of the first times, McCarthy does this thing where you're so not used to someone not explaining anything more than it's needed. He's like, this, he's basically saying in his typical prose, one paragraph, this is what happened. And there's a bit right at the start. I mean, this isn't really spoiling the plot. It's fairly early on. But there's a child born, which is clearly very unwanted, born into this horrendous world, not going to be loved. And the man in this situation, who is the brother of the woman who's given birth, understands this. And in about 4 lines, McCarthy just explains that he takes the baby to the woods and he puts it down and he leaves it and walks off. And I remember, and then at that point, I remember you have to turn the page, and I remember thinking, hang on, whoa. I went back. No, he does, and that's done. And it's like, there isn't this laden sort of emotional thing. This is just some event. This is an event in the world. It's done, and now we're going forward. And it sort of makes you realize, like, well, what's important for McCarthy? What is important? here.
Yeah, I think that's a recurring theme in his work. It's very much the idea of humans who are struggling with their origins, and that's a theme in literature going back to Oedipus. I mean, Oedipus. What does Oedipus find out? He finds out that he's having sex with his mother. And he's of incestuous union. He's of a base origin, and in some sense, for McCarthy, that's where we begin. I think we begin with that state, if you want to put it in theological terms, that state of fallenness. The human, that is, fallenness is the norm rather than the exception, and that's why I think he probably overlaps a lot with a lot of 20th century philosophers like the Derridas, the Heideggers, the Blanchots, which I talk about in the book. I don't think that's where he leaves it. I don't think he thinks that the human being is inherently corrupt. I think what's important to him is trying to show that goodness and mutual aid and cooperation and community are all possible despite living in the worst of all possible worlds. So he's not Leibnizian in that sense, but I think that's what's important to him. That plays it out in different ways throughout his novels. It plays out in his philosophical writings in terms of language. It plays out in his ethical considerations in books like No Country for Old Men and In the Road itself. It plays out in what he has to say about science and empiricism and materialism and how it relates to how the human being understands itself. I think that's what's important to him in his literature. It's a depiction of how we can understand ourselves in a very, very chaotic, hostile and violent world.
Mm. How does this relate to language? I mean, this is really the start of your book. Is this sort of problem of language, or for McCarthy, of labeling, of describing, the human working their way in the world? I mean, philosophers, of course, the subject object, the description of, is this thing the thing that is there, and in my relation to it, etc. This is the philosophical problem, but McCarthy sort of changes this into a literary problem. In what sense can language even help us describe where we are in the world? I think McCarthy is actually struggling with this himself on a meta level. Yeah.
Very much so. I think that's absolutely right, James. I think that he has two pieces that very much engage with the question of language in an unpublished screenplay, which is available at the archive in Texas State University in San Marcos even, and that's called Of Whales and Men. And then there's his recent philosophical essay. He wrote a piece of philosophy in the popular science journal Nautilus, I think in approximately 2017, where he tackles the question of language again. And also, I would say in his interview with Oprah Winfrey, one of the few people who interviewed Cormac McCarthy. When Oprah comes for you, you go. I put it to you that way, right?
That interview. As someone who conducts interviews, as my job now, that interview.
Go on, tell us.
Well, that interview just pains me because I just think, it's the most wasted opportunity, I think, in literary history.
Probably not for McCarthy. I would imagine. I think Oprah she had the road on Oprah Winfrey's book club, which basically makes it an automatic bestseller. And in that period, I thought it was quite funny that. Sorry, I'm slightly digressing here, but I thought it was funny actually. Sort of Oprah, this sort of, American paragon of, the sort of the can-do attitude and the work ethic, and she asked him why did he work, and he said didn't want to, didn't fancy it, Oprah, so I just thought that was always quite hilarious, and I think that really quite sort of jarred her. She was like, how could this accomplished man not work, or not be into that thing, but so in terms, they're the places where he talks about language. And in that screenplay, Whales and Men, which is a very interesting screenplay. For a philosopher, for a literary critic, I think they would, there's a reason it's not published. I'll put it to you that way, James. It's not very, very good. It's probably unfilmable. I don't know. Have you ever seen that, like, can you remember that Star Trek from the 1980s where they went back in time to save the whales, Captain Kirk and I can't remember what it was called. It was a terrible movie, right? It was kind of like that, but it's like a cross between that and The Road, basically. That's how I would describe Of Whales and Men. But there's tons, it's really badly constructed as well, like bad, a very expository character dialogue. People, individuals represent didactic ideas and things like that. So, but there's a lot of interesting information in there on how McCarthy thinks about the question of language, and there he seems to have this opposition. So language is, the act of naming. It's a very particularizing activity. It's very instrumental. It's useful. It's even evolutionarily useful. It's I named this, I named that, and by naming something, it's quite sort of biblical as well. And by naming something, we own it, we particularize it, and the way that's played out dramatically in the novel, in the screenplay, is that for McCarthy, that's a type of mutilation. Our efforts at organization and classification and naming is in fact kind of an ontological mutilation. We segment and cut up reality, sort of a more primordial reality. And of course, in the novel, the whales are the avatar of that sort of primordial oneness. I'll let you come back in there, James, because I could bang on for ages about that.
Well, one thing I wanted to say about the digression with just with Oprah and McCarthy not working is that he didn't work like stereotypically.
Yeah.
He didn't work a job, but he did work on his novels like rigorously. Like
excellent choice as well. I'm glad he did.
Yeah, best choice. But he was one of those people who said, "Yeah, I'm going to write, and that's all I'm going to do." And I basically lived in absolute squalor until he got the MacArthur, is it the MacArthur Genius? Or the
Correct, yeah.
grant? I mean,
so
up
like
until
late
that
70s,
point,
I think, yeah.
Yeah, up until that point, it's just, which I have massive respect for anyone who does that.
Yeah, I read. When I was doing some research in the archive for this book, one of the things I saw was that he was writing to his publisher, and he was like going, "The money's kind of running out," So I got a good 3 years of this, and I'm going to ride that gravy train for as long as it lasts. But then he was like, I'm going, look, back to being poor. He did say that in the interview with Oprah Winfrey as well. He did say, that kind of, stuff always turns up. It's not fun being poor. In fact, the two most important things in life, he says, are food and shoes. That's his ethics. Very simple things. If you don't have, everything else follows from that. Once you get those in, you're okay. But he can. Oh yeah, absolutely, because having shoes, my grandmother's nearly 100 years old. I mean, she's about 100 in a couple of days' time actually, and that was the difference between shoes were the difference between being absolutely poor, impoverished, and having a well-heeled lifestyle, I suppose.
Wow. And I mean, in relation to our common notion of poverty now, though,
Oh anyway. God, yeah. We were born under a lake, yeah.
I mean, it's all right. So this idea of language, this idea of claiming of this thing is this. Now I know where I am. I'm anchored. I think this is the big struggle, and maybe it's the struggle for. I mean, which is right. Why The Road is perhaps a good entry place is because you have a bit more to hold on to with this dialogue between the father and son, which is a lot more relatable. But to dive into any of the other of McCarthy's novels, he is consistently trying to move away from this. Things are described concretely, but you still feel that you're just sort of immersed in a place, and you're not completely, I don't know, stratified or striated, however you want to say it. He's always trying to avoid that complete closure, and so often I get this real. He's one of the few writers that gives me a real deep, almost like an anxious trembling, because you never really know where you are, right? And you get this the most with Blood Meridian, of course, but especially in your sense of place, you think, where are we going? Where the hell am I?
That's why his writing is so powerful, I think. I think that it's I wrote a lot about in the book about the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot, who I don't think McCarthy self-consciously set out to write Suttree as a Blanchotian novel. I just think that sort of Blanchot's themes are very pertinent to how we can understand McCarthy and what makes his literature intelligible. And what that is what Blanchot says is that what writing is, in his book The Space of Literature, is writing is that which sort of resists our ability to name, to own. It's kind of sort of divests us of ourselves, of our subjectivity. If writing is not destabilizing you, if it's not injecting uncertainty into your preconceptions, your customs, your traditions, your self-understanding, then it's worthless, really. It's just it's didactic, or it's something else. It's a shopping list or whatever, as wrote. And that, I think, is what McCarthy tries to do. So something like Blood Meridian, especially with the violence, it's designed to take you out of place. It takes you out of the world in some sense. Not literally, but it disrupts your ability to luxuriate in the confines of your tradition and existence and social niceties which you tell yourself.
Especially with the, of course, we had to bring him in at a certain point, especially with Judge Holden. There's a certain point, in the novel, you read enough, maybe once you're a quarter in, you get this absolute trepidation in your gut anytime the Glanton gang or Judge Holden's starting a speech, because as soon as that finishes, because it might be something like, and then Judge Holden approached a camp, and you go, this
ain't going in well.
It's about to happen, and then the next page, there's babies on spikes, and it's just an absolute must. There's a point where all of a sudden the judge is holding two babies as clubs, and it's you don't know what to do with it, and it's like with this Blanchotian, as you say, this absent core of the text. Within this violence is like normally with war, with a purpose, perhaps like with a crusade, there's something, but with the Glanton gang, and the reason it's such trepidation is you're almost like scarpering to find a justification, and so that absent core is like the violence. There's no core to the violence. It's violence for its own sake.
That's right. The violence is the thing, basically. That is the absent core in Blood Meridian, and especially with the character of Judge Holden, who really is one of literature's most terrifying, awful, brutal characters. I think Humbert, I think, would probably outstrip him. I think I mentioned that in the book, Humbert, from Lolita, in terms of unreliable narrators. Now, I suppose to add to that, sorry, James, I think we might have to edit that. I just lost my train of thought there. So what are we at? 40 minutes. So I'm just looking for a pin. Well, I'll remember that. I'll take it out or whatever. Or I'll let you... Okay, yeah. So sorry, what were you asking me again there? And I'll...
So Judge Holden and violence being... for its own sake, and you were then saying that Humbert outstripped Judge Holden.
Right, okay, so I'll take it from there. And I think that with Judge Holden and the violence in Blood Meridian, your reaction is really, apt. You said it induces a physical effect, is what you're saying. The novel is really visceral. And it turns one's innards outwards. That's what it does. It's visceral. It makes the viscera apparent, right? And that's the terra damnata that he calls about it. It's what's really interesting about it as a literary accomplishment is he's made Hades, the underworld. He's made it, brought it to the surface. He's made it explicit, and he shows how it coexists with our everyday understanding of the world, and that violence is resident. It doesn't go away. He even says that in one of his interviews, when he's talking about politics. He's very circumspect on politics. He doesn't really talk about it for obvious reasons, but one of the things he says is, one of the things he thinks we should avoid is the idea that we can live in a world without violence. You know, yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, really interesting. And that thought is that, you know, we need to. Yeah, violence is constitutive of what humanity is. Now, that's not an injunction to be violent. He's showing how violence manifests itself. He's showing how we can use violence even to undermine and act as an impediment to more brutal and tyrannical forms of violence. And that's why the kid, who is this sort of really diminutive character next to the judge who sort of dominates and looms so large over the novel, that's why the kid, who's also not a nice character, an unsympathetic character, the kid is like a psychopath, you know, of the highest order, but he does have this sort of ability to see past or see something else, something out of other than the judge.
And I think one place where I guess you don't struggle, but you suddenly have to change almost the cogs of how you read, is that I struggle to classify McCarthy as in any sense an existentialist in the sort of classical way, because existentialism is very human. You know, who am I? You know, where am I in the world? What am I doing? And violence in relation to death, you know, these as normally seen as these existential problems. War is this existential crisis of the death of thousands of souls. For McCarthy, he's gone beyond existentialism. We're just speaking of the cosmos. It's like, all right, you know, and I don't know if you'd agree with that. I mean, did you see McCarthy as I guess caring about that meaning of the human life in any real sense, as, you know, as death, because death arrives so abruptly, it becomes something else, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I could necessarily see him as an existentialist. And I mean, a lot of the early material on Cormac McCarthy, a lot of the early literary reception of him, people like Vereen Bell. He wrote a book called The Ambiguous Nihilism of Cormac McCarthy, which is a good book. And I don't quite see him as, you know, that kind of I don't see McCarthy as that kind of sort of individualist existentialist, you know, where it's all about choice and voluntarism and the sovereignty of the self. I think it's quite, if anything, it's quite the opposite. I don't particularly think that's what existentialism happens to be. Like, I don't, you know, maybe you could see probably some dimensions of Sartre there. You know, what does Sartre say? You know, in existentialism is a humanism. You know, it's the self. Yeah, I think you could probably, in that sense, you know, you could see an existentialism in McCarthy, but it's a very American existentialism, perhaps. So it's like, you know, in existentialism, what does Sartre say? He says existence precedes essence, right? And the self has no essence. There is an absent core in the self. There is no self. All the self is the things that it does. It's existence, right? It's practical activities, and that I think I could see in Cormac McCarthy. I don't think he has that. You know, with death, I don't think, you know, in a lot of existentialism, you know, people like Camus and things like that, you get this sort of, this haughty triumph over our own mortality, I think. You know, there's something that sort of death is vanquished. And, you know, you see that in Camus with the myth of Sisyphus as well. What does he say? What's the only philosophical question? Is the question why about suicide? You know, should I kill myself or not? You know, and have a cup of coffee or go to the beach. I think which was, to be fair, Camus' recommendation. You know, go for a swim, go for a dance, any of these nice things, right? Yeah. So, but I don't see that in McCarthy. That kind of hardcore voluntarism, you know, that I can sort of face down my finitude. I think he makes a more sort of, I think there's a more interesting existentialism, maybe I could put it that way, in him, that he's, you know, mortality is constitutive of what we are, and sort of, you know, it's how we construct our existence in terms of desire and ethics and values and purposes that enable us to stave off that question, even if it's always present. Yeah, so probably, a non-triumphalistic existentialist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I mean, it's something you bring in as well in relation to sort of, you know, people will call McCarthy. I mean, they've said that Blood Meridian is the one example of the great American novel, right? But it's almost like, well, is it? Because it's almost like the anti-great American novel, because any of his books actually that take place often in these Western, I mean, they're almost always a sort of Western setting, even if it's modern. But they're not Tombstone. They're not Wyatt Earp turning up and becoming this law-abiding citizen who, builds on the frontier and everything's going well and they're building the great American dream. I'm thinking of Outer Dark once again. They start in this what seems to be a small self-sufficient cabin, and they're not really doing anything. They haven't got much. It's pretty much failed. And this idea of self-sufficiency, so as you're saying, it's like, as I guess to take in Nietzsche with some sort of existentialism, or Camus, it's like, all right, you have that understanding of your place in the world, and you try to go beyond the mortality. You try find something to go beyond the question. But it's almost like with McCarthy, it's like, that's already failed. Now we need to go beyond that failure somehow. So it's not, that's failed, but we haven't killed ourselves. So you're in a world almost where the question of mortality has been answered for you, but you still have to exist.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think if there's a figure from that, that French literary philosophical tradition that McCarthy is closest to, and I write about Blanchot and I write about Derrida and all these folk, and I don't think he is those people. I don't think McCarthy is like a postmodernist. I think he's got quite a. I think he's got If the archives tell us anything, he's got a lot of impatience for that rhetoric. I think he's, if anything, he's probably I don't know, meta-modern. Maybe somebody might put him in that regard. He speaks highly of Guy Davenport in the archive material. So I'm not sure if you've Guy Davenport. He wrote an interesting book called the Geography of the Imagination, but. And also, I think he's a translator of Heraclitus, who is in the epigraph of Blood Meridian. Heraclitus is referenced, war is the father of all and the king of all, and so on. And I think that sorry, I've lost my train of thought again, James. Could you just give me a reminder of what you were asking? Sorry.
Existentialism beyond a world that's already accepted existentialism. How do we get beyond that, where the world's already accepted our mortality?
I'm back. So the figure from that tradition of French literary philosophers that he would probably be most close to would be Samuel Beckett, I think. Especially something like The Road. The Road looks like Waiting for Godot. There's a stripped down world. There's nothing really there. There's two characters, effectively, for the most of it. And it's that sense of fail again, fail better. That motivates the characters after they acknowledge that this is a world without redemption.
Mm-hmm. That was the question I was going to ask, and I think it's almost the question everyone comes to with McCarthy, I guess, in a way. Do you think there's any redemption within his worlds? I mean, of course, we're going across a big oeuvre of novels here, but they're all on the same thread in a certain sense. Do you think? And I think they're all theologically in the same state of humanity. I think that's the big thing.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any? I guess a better one would be: is there any possibility of redemption in these ones?
Yeah, probably not. I suppose it depends on what you mean by redemption. When I understand redemption, I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, I understand redemption to mean salvation in a state of bliss, where existing in a state of belonging without possibility of loss. That would be what redemption is, and in some sense that is precluded continually in McCarthy. Now, that's not to say that human beings don't have a desire for that. I mean, clearly all of or many of Cormac McCarthy's characters, people like the kid, people like the boy in The Road, Cullen, Rinty in Outer Dark, they are trying to find something beyond their existence. They're trying to step outside of a very cruel and purposeless and malign world and hostile environment in which they find themselves. And again, I suppose it's the existentialist question. You can only find that in terms of the things you do. Right, so there's no guarantee of redemption in McCarthy. That's how I would see it. I don't see the evidence for that. If we look at, say, something like The Road, what happens at the end of The Road? He meets up with someone who helped. The father dies. The kid meets up with a surrogate family, and the food is running out, basically. And that is the redemption there, I think. That ersatz community, the ability to form ersatz communities or precarious communities in spite of this implacably absurd universe in which we inhabit. Now, that also says something about what constitutes moral activity, and McCarthy is American, I think. He's got that sort of new world spirit in him, that it's not abstraction. It's not. Morality is in the doing. I mean, you could call that Christian if you want. Morality is exemplary in terms of the activities which we engage in to improve the material world which we inhabit, and that's where the redemption lies. I think, if you could call it redemption, it's the doing of good things. And it's really simple, that's really simple ethics. I'm not sure that's kind of, I'm sorry I've come on your podcast, Hermitix podcast, and I've come on with something really, really bland, something like you're getting a Christmas cracker, be nice, do the good things, Yeah, turn up to the judge and make him give him a blankie and a cup of tea. Chill out.
I think out of all people, he'd probably like that. He'd probably be the one you didn't kill if you gave.
He'd start droning on though. He'd start droning on one day.
I like this actually, because it's something I wanted to bring in. I think the character of Judge Holden, undoubtedly, as we've said. I mean, you said there's not many. Hubert Hummer is one that you said. Maybe Nurse Ratched might.
Oh yes, that's good.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But one thing that I really enjoyed the fact you made this quite explicit as well, is that you're not. I think because he's become such a figure, because Blood Meridian's become such this cult book, and this generation's Moby Dick, as Harold Bloom said, and just been heralded as this masterpiece, rightfully so. And from that, the judge has become this the character everyone talks about, and this sort of embodiment of, we could say the Freudian id, right? Is the embodiment of humans at their absolute worst. But in that has become almost like a fetishistic relationship with him, where people are like, yeah, the judge. I mean, there's this bit where he, and I like the fact you said he drones on. His dialogues.
Yeah.
You think, and the first time you read the book, you get wrapped up in it. But I think as you go back, you think, God, who? There's this naked 7-foot albino stood around a campfire, waxing lyrical on
here we go.
Everything. But it's almost like they're scared of him because they're like, it's not like they're astounded by his knowledge, which is supernatural, but they're like, you'd just be like, what in the world is this? What, why is this man naked again? That's the one thing.
Always with the shirt off, Judge. What's going on? Yeah, I think you're right. He is fetishized. I think you're right. I mean, even within, people who write on McCarthy, people who write on Blood Meridian, there's kind of there's a whole sort of sub micro genre on the judge itself, as a character. And the way I look at him is, he's like a tedious psychopath. That's how I look at him. And I think that's part of the genius of the way McCarthy has constructed the character. He's a hoodwinker. He's a fiddler. Of course, he literally ends playing the fiddle, doesn't he? At the end of the novel, he's like this really boring rationalist, this Victorian rationalist. It'd be like if sort of Richard Dawkins had was an albino and tall in the 1800s in America, basically, just going on all the time. Richard Dawkins, brilliant on biology and all the rest of it, but the judge character, I think, is yeah, it's just not. Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's important, James, the way why McCarthy frames the judge the way he does. The judge is not otherworldly, I don't think he's supernatural. No, I don't think he's materialist either. I think he's the word I think I use in the book is preternatural. So he's kind of a demigod, I guess, some existing somewhere between the heavens and the earth. And I mean that's why he's he does this in the middle of the novel. He lifts up a meteorite, and then the novel's bookended by meteorite showers actually, and in the middle he does this feat of strength where he lifts up a fallen meteorite. And I think what McCarthy's trying to do there, it's, one of the philosophers that we probably haven't talked about actually that influences McCarthy a lot, I think, is Plato. I think McCarthy was read into Plato a lot for a long period, so he knows his Plato for sure, as well as a lot of other philosophers, which we can talk about in a bit. But what does Plato say in the Symposium? What does he say that the human being is? The human being is this sort of median point between the heavens and the earth. So the idea in the Symposium is that sort of the human being is a sort of a being towards death. So it's a desiring being, it's a continually desiring being which moves towards the forms, or the eternal. And the judge is that. He's that. He's sort of a perversion of that thought of what the human being is. And that the human being is a material being, but it's also, in addition to that, it's the being that transcends that materiality. So it's not like, that's why I find the judge, he's kind of like this, I did say this, a Victorian naturalist. He's kind of like a really crap scientist. And there's a comedic element to him as well, I think, despite his horrific actions.
Yeah, I think so. I think actually, maybe this, but I think it actually opens with a comedic element as the judge's entry into the book is that he just convinces a crowd in sort of a feat of memetics that, doesn't he just say one line that everyone's in awe, everyone's in awe of this preacher's sermons, and then the judge just sort of says, isn't that guy, like, he convicts him, he says that he's touched a kid, I think, or something like that, and then all of a sudden the whole room has gone, has now turned against the preacher, and it's almost like the judge, it doesn't even matter to the judge, right? He comes in, he goes, everyone loves this guy, so he just goes, I think that was the guy who touched a kid, and then just sort of leaves, right? And it's just, he's, evil for
it's hideous, yeah. Yes, it's hideous. Yeah, it's hideous. It's macabre in the truest sense of the word. It's manifesting itself through a sort of by engendering our physical reaction to that thing. So it's an uncomfortable read. The blood meridian. Also, I think, in addition to what you were saying there, I think it's at some point in the novel he demonstrates paedophilic proclivities as well with a young girl, and again, and as the kid grows older, as the kid becomes wiser and more attuned to his trickery, he loses interest in the kid. So so it's a very So I always read children in McCarthy as as sort of avatars of futurity, the idea that the future is, the idea of possibility and creativity and fecundity, things like that. And what the judge is trying to do really is he's trying to close that down. He's trying to instrumentalize everything, as you say. He's trying to reduce everything to the present, to something that can be handled, or he keeps listing things in his notebook and then just tearing them up.
I'm in definite agreement with that. And of course, there's the reading that Blood Meridian is sort of a modern, like a Dante's Inferno, a walk through hell. But actually, that idea of a demigod, and this idea of children in McCarthy's work as the future. if you think about it in theological terms, this idea of, be like a child unto God, that childlike innocence is how you should approach God. The judge isn't ever really concerned with adults. They're just around him and he talks at them. Right, he's like, I'm right, I'm off again, yep. And they're just tools if he needs something, but if they die, they die. But whereas, as you say, children, it's almost like, right, I got to corrupt the childlike innocence. I've got to make sure you stay, as you were talking about that chain of being from Plato, the judge's job, almost in a way, is just to make sure people stay on the lower level, and the adults are there. He's like, they're evil, they're done. I don't know.
Yeah, things can't be otherwise. That's he makes that manifest. And I think if you want to talk about an ethics of McCarthy, I think that's probably one of the things that he would see, that I mean, he effectively says this in one of his interviews, like, that humans can be good and do things other than the way things are done, or things can be other than they are, or things can, there's the possibility of renewal and transformation is possible. Maybe not plausible, but it is possible for McCarthy. Yeah. In addition to what you said there, James, I would say, what is the opening words of Blood Meridian? Isn't it it's an injunction, isn't it? It's see the child, I think. Oh, fantastic. Look at that, right to hand.
Yeah, I think it's see the child, he is pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. Yeah. See the child.
Yeah, so I think we should take that injunction, to heart, basically, from McCarthy. That's what, see the future. See how the future can become manifest, because that's the opposite of nihilism, really, isn't it? The nihilism, everything is reducible to the present, to the now.
It starts with see the child and then ends. He is dancing. He says that he will never die. He never sleeps. So okay, see the future, but also right at the end, the devil never sleeps. So you're sort of between the two pillars of what are you seeing here? What are you seeing in the child? Are you seeing any potential for hope in the child?
Oh, are you asking? Oh, yeah.
Well, do you see? I mean, this was the question that was asked on the other one we did on Blood Meridian, that I did on Blood Meridian. But it was the idea of it: does the kid in any sense redeem himself?
He tries, but he fails. And he has a very, how do you say it, ignominious death. He dies in a bathroom. And I think, it's kind of funny as well. The judge kills him in a bathroom under a meteor shower. So we have the mixture of the heavens and, well, I'm going to say the earth, but obviously there's a scatological dimension to that as well, Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I guess, you spend a lot of time with ethics, so I think, how do you think it is that an ethics can arise from basically what is this grey? I think maybe, and you see this in Tolkien actually, this very Catholic idea of hope when there's literally no hope. So like, a big theme in Lord of the Rings is marching into somewhere where actually we pretty much know we're going to die, but we're doing it for the sake of the good. And that seems to be the only way ethics could arise in McCarthy's work. To take on the Glanton gang, you go, well, we're going to die, but we need to do this for the sake of the good itself.
I think so. Yeah, that does make sense to me. And oh gosh, it's a long time since I've read Tolkien. I understand Tolkien in the kind of as a type of a quest narrative. Lord of the Rings. I think that that's nothing profound about me saying that, but the road is also a type of a quest narrative. In fact, there's a very good piece on this by a scholar called Lydia Cooper. The working title of The Road is The Grail, right? So it's in the archive. It's started out as a text called The Grail. So there's definitely that sense of, I think there is that sense that one, has to find the good in confronting the worst. Like you can kind of think of that, that Christian idea, or maybe it's apocryphal, I'm not sure. The idea when Jesus goes down into hell, because only once he knows the worst can he find the moral resilience and the moral armor to to assert what is good and overcome evil.
Yeah, it's in the creed. He was in hell for 3 days. I think primarily, if I understand it, was to release all the people who were kept in Sheol. So all the people who were kept in this weird, banished Jewish hell.
Right. So that's interesting. I suppose that does ask sort of a political question as well, because what sort of Christ is doing there is it's a form of emancipation, a form of freedom. There seems to be less emancipation in McCarthy.
It's sort of the question as well of I just can't remember who said this, but I went. There's a saying from a monk where this monk had just kept praying for sort of just some respite from temptation and everything, and eventually the Lord spoke to him and said, "Keep your mind in hell and despair not." Basically saying, look, you need to be there for you to be able to have that contrast. So something like the best place to find Jesus is in hell. You almost like you need McCarthy's world to be able to go, all right, I need the good. After you read Blood Meridian, I'm going to go donate to a food bank.
yeah, exactly. But I think there was something true in that, James. So like doing good is just doing good. It's we're clearly not all sociopaths. And it's actually, there's something simple about that. I don't mean it in a disparaging sense of the term simple. It's a sort of a simple ethics, like how am I going to be nice to a kid? Well, I don't know, buy them a jigsaw or something like that, or show them some astronauts on YouTube, whatever. So I think, and I think that is quite in tune with the American side of Cormac McCarthy. And just going back to what you were saying, when he was doing Blood Meridian, I think he just called Blood Meridian his Western. They just called it the Western before he titled it, and the good is uncomplicated. I think in that sense, it's that which is good is that which is doing. So that's probably where he stops with Platonism, because of course for Platonism the good is an abstraction. It's an abstraction out of the physical world. You abstractify out of the apparent world, the world of the senses. That is secondary for Plato. It's not real, and I think that's probably where he would separate. I think from Plato. We see it in his play, The Sunset Limited, actually, and which starts with an act of the good. It's a religious individual, Mr. Black, saves an atheist from committing suicide, and it's the conversation they have after that.
One thing I want to bring in, because this is, I'm thinking about it as we've been chatting. There isn't really a sense of, so when we're talking about just to bring it back, I guess, to ethics, when we're talking about the good, this happens in with other people. At the end of the road, for instance, the father dies, and it's like, but fortunately the boy meets these other people, and they're strangers, and there's a bit of fear about him meeting them and having to go off with them, but ultimately the good has been found, and actually there are still people, as they say in the book, keeping the flame alive, right? And so and this happens throughout a lot of his novels. People banding together is where the good is. Oh, you've just frozen a bit. Oh, there you go. And people banding together as the good, and it's almost like there isn't civilization. The idea of a society for McCarthy isn't really there. I can't think of a time when a town or civilization in general plays a role.
That's interesting. There is lots of towns in Blood Meridian, but they're usually destroyed, and they're places where the Glanton gang goes, and they get drunk and go to brothels and indulge themselves in all kinds of ways. So it's usually there's usually the locale tends to be between places. It's between urban environments, as far as I know. I can't think of anything that an exception to that. Yeah, probably in the Sunset Limited takes place in a city. The Sunset Limited takes place in the city. Although it's very, the city's very much at a remove, and it's a kind of a self-contained world. It's Mr. Black's apartment, where the whole play takes place. Maybe I think some of his in the Stonemason. I think also one of the characters moves to the city, but it's always kind of bad things happen there. So I suppose that bespeaks a. Yeah, so I can see where you're coming from with the Tolkien reference as well. Tolkien is kind of anti-technological, anti-modern, kind of proto-Heideggerian. When was he proto-Heideggerian? Heidegger was proto-Tolkien, shall we put it that way? And I think in McCarthy, it does speak to his understanding of about what he has to say about how humans gather, how we organise. And I think one of the things I talk about in the book, in one of the later chapters, if I recall, is the idea that in McCarthy, I don't think he's Hobbesian in some sense. With Hobbes, what's Hobbes' idea? Hobbes' idea is that we enter into contracts of mutual self-recognition to stave off the chaos, to stave off the state of nature. In Rousseau, we get the opposite of that. We get this idea that sort of civilization is inherently corrupting. Any form of gathering is something which perverts spontaneous human freedom and emotions and creativity and imagination and natural equality. So civilization introduces hierarchy for Rousseau. In nature we are equal, right? And I don't think McCarthy would subscribe to either of those. Maybe he's in a hinterland between. I always sort of see him as sort of quasi-anarchistic. I don't think he's like. I don't think he's an anarchist. I don't think he's. He's not an anarchist like. Sorry, I can't say his name. Kropotkin, yeah, Kropotkin, or Proudhon. But I think he's definitely got an anarchist spirit, and that tells us something interesting about how humans gather. That's how humans gather in very precarious, spontaneous ways. So I think he's sort of somewhere between Hobbes and Rousseau. In his novels, the urban, as you said, the technological he's quite skeptical of it. We see this especially in his screenplays like The Counselor, for example, or No Country for Old Men. The character of Chigurh is sort of postmodern rationalist. He kills people with an electronic cattle prod, and that's some the urban, the city, technology are something I think McCarthy is inherently skeptical of. However, I think that he does try to offer a kind of an alternative to that in some way. I think that takes place through these very precarious ersatz communities that form throughout his work. We see it in particularly with Suttree. We see the community of outcasts of the McAnally Flats gather together in very, very precarious, sort of brittle, contingent ways. And that's natural. That's kind of spontaneous. A spontaneous gathering. But there's also, it's premised on the fact that it will also disassemble again and reform. I think what also evidences that is that he's really skeptical of people from institutions. Those who represent institutions tend to be, people like social workers, teachers, police, judges, priests as well. I think they tend to be corrupt or on the make or manipulative in some way. And in like even the Border trilogy, all the way throughout the Border trilogy, the central characters are always, forming their own sort of mutual forms of recognition, mutual reciprocity. So that sense of mutualism, or there's this desire for mutual recognition, which is always possible, right? Which is always possible despite the surveillances and the impositions and the controlling representatives of the state or institutions generally.
So the wilderness becomes its own thing, right? The sort of Hobbesian wilderness, that he says, if you cast out there just an animal, I guess for McCarthy, that's like, well, that's where the interest, that's where the becoming of a human being happens. It's almost like as soon as the frontier is no longer a frontier, move on. Why? There's nothing of interest there anymore.
They wrote on. He says it all the time in Blood Meridian.
Yeah, they wrote. Maybe that's why they wrote on, because it's like, to use continental language, it's like it's no longer a smooth space. It's completely striated. We sort of know who people are here now. You got the butcher, you got the baker. It's like this place is done. It's sort of solidified itself. There's nothing moving. There's no longer that. Yeah, well, I guess looping right back down to the start. It's like a town that's labelled itself, and it's now contained itself in language. Well, all right, well, nothing's growing.
Finished,
yeah, it's finished. Sort of, and to jump right to the end of, as you say, with Blood Meridian, with Heraclitus, it's like, this is quite literally the same river now. I'm not interested.
Yeah, very good, yeah. So that was my thought, So like, the anarchists, there's a sort of an anarchos element to it. Like, there's a sort of a certain contingency to reality itself, I think, and, you can, there's no guarantee that the judge will not come along. I mean, the end of Blood Meridian, the epilogue to Blood Meridian kind of gives us that, out in the desert, in the time after the period of Blood Meridian. What do we see? We don't know if the judge dies or not, whatever. But there's a burial scene which takes place at the end, and it's just like these bone pickers, slowly punctuating, where a new Prometheus might be born, as it suggests, as Harold Bloom talked about, so that possibility, yeah. So there's no guarantee of redemption, but the fact that there is no guarantee of redemption is not necessarily a bad thing. It means that that things that we can engage in commitments and attempt to make the world a better place and engage in activities and actions that will improve the material coordinates of our lives, and that's kind of how I see it. And that is something that always has to be done. There's work to be done. It's anarchic, if not an anarchist. I mean, again, McCarthy is very circumspect on politics and his political nature. I think it's been reported that he's the only thing, the only political activism he engaged in was, I think, like releasing wolves back into the wild, which is pretty punk rock, James. Which is pretty punk rock if you think about it. That's pretty anarchic.
That was with, I can't remember, he wanted to do that with someone also well known, didn't he? I can't remember who it was.
Yes, it was another activist. The name escapes me. That's right.
Yeah. Well, I feel we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything you'd like to add about your book that you feel we haven't touched on?
I don't think so. Is there anything you want to ask me? I think I'm okay. I think you've given me a great opportunity to talk about loads of things, so thank you so much for that.
The question I always ask is, where would you, we've sort of touched on this quite a lot, but where would you advise people to start with McCarthy?
Okay, I'm gonna go with Suttree. Yeah, my usual advice is The Road or No Country for Old Men, but this time I'm going to go with Suttree because I think it's his best novel, and just stick with it. Just stick past the first 50 pages and the sexual congress with the watermelon, and it opens up after that. I think it's a brilliant novel. It's funny. It's hilarious. It's his most class conscious novel. It's also probably his most autobiographical novel, and for that reason alone, that will give you a really good entry point to McCarthy. If you want something shorter, read The Road.
Okay. Well, I believe your book can be found via Edinburgh University Press. I imagine they'll probably release a paperback within due course. They usually do. But it's Cormac McCarthy, Philosophy and the Physics of the Damned, Patrick O'Connor. So I'll put links for that in the description. Are you working on any more McCarthy stuff, or are you settled now for a while?
I am working on some McCarthy stuff currently. I'm doing some stuff. I'm going to be speaking at the International Cormac McCarthy Conference in Dublin, which is in June, I believe. It's coming up middle of June. So if anyone is interested, they should go check that out. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cormac McCarthy and Edmund Burke. I think, in light of what we were talking about this afternoon as well, I thought that would be an interesting comparison to tease out in Trinity College Dublin, where Burke went. So that might be fun. In terms of, go ahead. I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure. I think it's there, but I think there might be differences as well. I think Burke is a pretty interesting cat. He was Protestant, but like his sister was Catholic for starters. So he's very sort of mixed reception, and that's I honestly don't know yet, James. I'm going to have a think about it. I just think about it. I can see comparisons for sure, especially the idea of, you think of Burke and the reflections of the Revolution of France, fighting off the possibility of abstract thought and revolutionary zeal and, the geometrical arrangement of society.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, yeah, so no other books on the way, or just the conference?
Yet no other books. I'm doing some work on so thanks for the opportunity to plug my pluggables. I'm doing a little work on the French film philosophy. Basically, I'm working on a writer called I'm working on Merleau-Ponty's writings on film, and a French writer called Henri Hegel, who is not really in translation, but he's got an interesting book called Le Cinéma et le Sacre. So Cinema and the Sacred, I guess. And I'm also writing on the French filmmakers and philosophers, the Dardenne brothers. So I'm writing more journalistic articles. Sorry, not journalistic articles, scholarly articles at the moment. And I have to plug, if you don't mind, the MAs in continental philosophy. David Webb would hang me from a lamppost in the centre of Stoke if I didn't. I've
never had a chance to promote it, but there you go. If you want to do a fantastic masters in continental philosophy, go to Staffordshire University under David Webb, and now Patrick O'Connor, because it's where I did my masters, and
indeed
it worked out very well.
Yeah, so
and there's now another course as well now, isn't there?
There is. So we do an MA in continental philosophy, all distance, part-time, full-time. We also have an MA in philosophy of nature, information and technology. So it's kind of like continental philosophy of science. So thank you for allowing me to peddle my wares.
That's right. It's it was where I sort of learnt my chops, I guess, in a way. And you also run Thales Well podcast. Well, yeah, I'll be sure to put all those links in the description below. Patrick O'Connor, thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.